go ahead and get started just so we make sure we have plenty of time for this great discussion and lecture. My name is Holly Fernandez Lynch. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and I'm the co-chair of the REP series along with Steve Jaffe. And today we're really thrilled to welcome Sneha Dave for a discussion on inclusion of adolescents and young adults in clinical research. I'll just say a couple of brief words by way of housekeeping announcements before introducing our speaker. You can see on the slide here a list of our upcoming speakers through June, and we have a broader list that will be posted on the website soon. But just a quick note that next month on May 10th, we will not be hosting a REPS lecture, but instead invite you to attend Dr. Jason Karlowicz's Renee Fox lecture on medicine, culture, and society, which is titled What It's Like to Be a Person Living with Dementia. Then we'll have one final REPS speaker on June 14th, Reshma Ramachandran from Yale. We'll take a break over the summer and start back up again in September. And just as a reminder, as we continue to add to our list of prospective speakers, please share suggestions for people that you would love to hear from, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds and who would contribute diverse perspectives to issues in research ethics and policy. Our persistent reminder of our online research ethics resources from our department, a series of short research ethics courses available for free continuing education credit, and a hearty thanks to our reps co-sponsors who you see listed here, and special thanks to our REPS coordinator, Lisa Bailey. Okay, so with that, I will introduce Sneha, who graduated from Indiana University in May 2020, where she created her own major in chronic illness advocacy as well as journalism. She created Generation Patient and its program, the Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network, to develop support systems for adolescents and young adults with chronic conditions across the US and internationally. She's completed an undergraduate research fellowship in health policy at Harvard, has interned at numerous locations, including Pfizer, in issues related to health economics and outcomes research. She's served on the Democratic National Committee, Disability Policy Subcommittee, and recently joined the Midwest Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council, an independent appraisal committee of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER. And if that weren't enough, she also serves on the FDA's Patient Engagement Collaborative and in a variety of other capacities. So we are thrilled to have you today. A quick word about how we'll handle the questions and discussion. Those of you who are online are welcome when the time comes to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud, or if you'd rather post your question in the chat, I will happily read it for the room to hear. And then we are recording this session and we will post the video to the department's website as soon as it's ready. Okay, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, for inviting me here. And I'm super excited to talk about this topic that is very important to not only myself, but our entire generation of patients. So as Holly mentioned, I'm Sneha. I am also a person with lived experience. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis when I was a little under 6 years old, and I'm now 24. So I've lived with this condition for the majority of my life and have had major surgeries throughout adolescence and young adulthood. So I've been on a lot of medications throughout my entire life. And that really led into what is now Generation Patient. And so I wanted to just start out with this quote, because I think a lot of times when we talk about clinical research and trials, we think of numbers, but really wanted to contextualize this with patients' experiences. So meet me in a place where I'm a person, not a problem to be solved. So just to highlight the importance of focusing on the young adult patient demographic. So over 85% of kids with chronic conditions are now surviving into adulthood. And so we know that with the advent of new technologies, medicines, we're living longer. And this brings in a whole new demographic to really think about and focus on as more and more people are being diagnosed at younger ages. And then just a statistic from the CDC, which is really important because a lot of times society doesn't think that young people are sick or we can be sick and have these debilitating conditions. But 54% of adults ages 18 to 34 live with a chronic condition. And as you can see, 22 had more than one chronic condition. And this is an editorial that Sydney Reed, who is our director of operations at Generation Patient, and I published about some of the most pressing needs for focusing on this patient demographic as it pertains to the various systems that we encounter throughout adulthood. Disclosures, we are an independent organization that's very important in guiding our work and making sure that we are really advocating for what we feel like is important as patients. And before I delve into this topic more specifically, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about the work that we do at Generation Patient, because that's really informed a lot of our interest and idea in focusing on adolescents and young adults specifically in clinical trials. And so when we think about the different programs that we do, we've gotten a lot of feedback from young adult patients, but also have really tried to co-create a lot of what we feel like is the most important for clinical research to include us and really distinguish us from pediatrics and from adults. So as you can see at Generation Patient, we do events, meetings, and programs. We have a big focus on peer support. So we've done a little over 450 peer support meetings. The way that we think about peer support is an intervention rather than a service. And so we really believe that this is a huge component of our lives as we're transitioning and transferring into adulthood with lifelong conditions. Another big component of our work is in higher education. So we are working on this from a systems level, but also individual resource sharing. So last year we did a roundtable on higher ed and chronic medical disabilities, where we published about a 45-page proceedings document that highlights some of the most pressing needs for chronically ill students. And again, all of these things, higher education, mental health, all play a role. And when we're thinking about the inclusion representation within clinical research. And I think that's one of the big things I want to highlight today is that we think about clinical research in a silo, but when we're thinking about this age demographic and the unique considerations globally that we're facing as we're entering adulthood, all very important considerations. The Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network, which is our only disease-specific programming. So we focus on all chronic and rare conditions, but IBD is our only disease-specific programming, as I mentioned. We do a fellowship where we train young adult patients with IBD to really engage in self-advocacy, not only for themselves, but for other patients to come. And then we do our roundtable on young adults with IBD, which actually has a session coming up specifically on adolescents and young adults with IBD in clinical trials. So we try to bring together patients and providers for meaningful discussions about what is under-discussed within our age and patient demographic. Our work with clinical trials really falls under this health policy. So our health policy lab was established last January of 2022, and we're focused on 3 core issues in addition to our health policy scholars program, which provides direct education to young adult patients. So these 3 issues are pharmaceutical direct-to-consumer advertising, which is a topic I discussed yesterday, the inclusion of adolescents and young adults in clinical trials, which is what I'll of course discuss today. And then the last area is patent reform, specifically with the United States Patent and Trademark Office and FDA collaboration. And so this is our team. We have an awesome, entirely young adult patient-led team. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the experiences of our community members within clinical research, but also what we feel like is mounting evidence that we need to treat young adults differently as we treat pediatrics and adults. So this is Rose. She is one of our community members. She lives with cystic fibrosis, is 21 years old, is a college student, has multiple jobs, and has participated in a clinical trial for cystic fibrosis. And one of the most pressing things that she highlighted was the idea of compensation and how this was critical for her to actually be able to participate in a trial, especially as a young person who's balancing numerous jobs, is financially independent for the first time. And so when we're thinking about the difference between, again, kids and adults, you think about the compensation component and whether it makes sense to compensate patients across the lifespan differently, depending on developmentally and socially where they are as well. So the bottom line is that we need to include and understand how we're including adolescents and young adults in clinical trials. And so I'm going to go into this more specifically, and I'm going to try not to rush this because I have so much to cover, but I also want to get to the questions as well. And I'm going to also find a place to put this water bottle so I don't hold it awkwardly.
I think there's something right on the side there on the bottom.
Oh, great. Yes, this is just for water bottles, so that's perfect. Okay, so as you can see, pediatrics has been pretty well defined by a variety of regulatory bodies and the ICH. So the way that they've stratified this is very unique to the developmental periods, and one could argue there's always a better way to stratify depending on the disease group, but in general, adolescence has been pretty well defined. If you look at the American Academy of Pediatrics, the FDA, et cetera, you can see again that the way that age has been stratified is a little bit different between each body, but still fairly similar in terms of their understanding of early childhood, early adolescence, late adolescence, et cetera. And then when we look over here at this table, we can also see how, especially early on in early childhood, there has been different ways that age has been defined in terms of postmenstrual age, term, post-term, neonatal period, et cetera. So there is a lot surrounding age, but it kind of all stops at 17 or 18. And that's a huge problem when we're thinking about the growing number of young adults and the different physiological outcomes for age as well. So, and again, a huge problem is that between agencies, both in the US and internationally, there is a huge discrepancy, not only in the way that we're thinking about age as a stratification, but also in the way that we're defining young people. And so, as you can see, the World Health Organization calls young adults youth, and a variety of other methods. The FDA has adolescents defined, but there's no definitions for young adults. And so we see pediatrics defined as children younger than 17, and the AAP considered up to 22 as pediatric. So again, just a wide range of definitions and no standardization in terms of terminology, but also stratification. And so as you can see, the problem here, which is that clinical care increasingly and still treats young people as the same as adults or older adults, despite mounting evidence that there are differing outcomes for, especially for particular diseases and conditions. Cancer being one of the most studied in terms of differential outcomes, which I'll get to. And I really wanted to include this slide because there are so many unique social considerations for young adults. So when we think about the transition and transfer of care from pediatric to adult centers, you think about the loss to follow-up, the loss of, or the continuity of care that decreases when we're transitioning from the pediatric to adult setting, and the impact that that can have on our trial participation, and especially if we see pediatric and adult centers working in silos, as they still do in clinical research. The unique socio-emotional challenges. So young adults with chronic conditions are actually 363% more likely to attempt suicide. And when we look at the mental health outcomes, we also know that we're really lagging behind, but also what role can that play in our participation and engagement with our own healthcare and with research. Financial instability, this goes without saying that young adult patients tend to be some of the most financially unstable age groups, and especially when you're adding in a chronic illness and unique economic burden that comes with having to pay for medications, medical appointments, et cetera. And then the competing priorities such as higher education, work, and family caregiver duties. One thing that we have especially noticed is the immense toll that family caregiver duties can take on young adults. And I think in some ways we're seeing more and more young adults being burdened with that, or not burdened, but having that additional duty as well. So now with physiological considerations for adolescents and young adults, so certainly there are social and systemic barriers, but when you think about the physiological conditions, these are still very much in existence as well. So one of which is hormonal changes. So you see the effect of various organ systems in this time period, as well as the immune system and the caloric and metabolic burden during this time period in particular. And these might be different for adolescents and young adults, but again, since we don't have proper definitions, it's hard to differentiate even between these two cases or categories. So for example, in diabetes, there's increased growth hormone levels, which result in insulin resistance. And we also see a lack of physician awareness on hepatic and renal metabolism, especially during puberty and its effects on inappropriate dosing and prescribing as well. Another area is with the immune system. So we know that the immune system differs for young people versus old people. I mean, we saw that with the outcomes for the COVID vaccine, for example, and this can affect the response to treatment and its susceptibility to certain diseases. And so we also know that there's changes in the immune system that impact that during puberty onset that impact conditions such as multiple sclerosis. So this has been studied again, but has been done so very minimally and only for particular disease groups. And the next sort of area that I wanted to discuss is growth and development. So this is huge, especially for our patient demographic. And I'm going to transition to looking at my slides here, just because I think it's a little bit difficult for me to look there and here at the same time. But when we're looking at growth and development, especially the physiological changes and the risk of side effects as well, I think this is something, side effects and safety profile has been by far the biggest concern of our age demographic. And I'll get to why a little bit later in terms of how we're lumped in adverse event reporting systems. So when we think about growth and development specifically, some medications might affect bone density. So think of steroids, et cetera, and others can impact fertility, again, which is a huge, huge topic that a lot of our community members will raise around fertility and family planning, et cetera. Oftentimes, because this is not a topic that is discussed as often with young people, just because we're thought to not think about these things until our 30s or late 20s, et cetera. And then, of course, CNS development, which is not complete until around 25 years, which also could have a big impact. And the other area is, do we have a firm understanding of when vital organs are complete as well? And so when we're looking at the research, it's just very unclear as to the different developmental time periods in this particular age demographic. And so organs like the liver and kidney may still be developing, which can, of course, affect the ability to process and eliminate drugs from the body as well. So those are just some physiological considerations that we have identified as we are doing this sort of self-research on our own as young adult patients. Other considerations include the fact that for adolescents and young adults, there might be a shorter disease history. There might be a shorter time in which we've lived with the disease than older adults or adults. And so there's that potential to capture the efficacy of the therapy early on, given that there's that shorter time period that we have actually been diagnosed. The other consideration is this idea of long-term safety. So it feels like in clinical trials that, we're only looking at short-term safety data. And for young people who are on these medications or will be likely or similar medications for years or decades, it's something that has to really be discussed at the forefront, especially because these therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies are not, non-complex compounds. They're very complex and they're very scary when we look at the potential for long-term implications. And this is something that we feel like is going to be an emerging topic, especially with CAR T and gene therapies, the long-term safety profile of these sorts of therapeutics, and something that we feel like is exciting for us, given that we've been thinking about long-term safety for so long due to our age. And the potential toxicity from overdosing. So in our peer support meetings, we have had no shortage of people share about their stories of having dosage that's higher than what they actually needed. I have personally experienced overdosing as well. And so I think that this is a problem that, again, is not being discussed enough in terms of the dosing requirements for different bodies and different developmental periods. Again, because we're often grouped, like 18 and 60-year-olds are often grouped together. And then fertility and family planning, of course, which I mentioned is something that is really, really important to our demographic. So this is an example of another young adult who participated in a gene trial and discussed how there was a big lack of communication surrounding fertility and family planning. And this last sentence is really important. Actually, sorry, I'm using my computer now, not the PowerPoint. But so in this, it says, I think they didn't really talk about it with me because I was young and not of the age to have a life partner who might be married. And so I think there's a huge stigma and perception of not talking about fertility and family planning early just because of the age of a lot of our community members. Even though I sincerely believe these conversations should be happening in the mid-teens at the very least, especially when we're thinking about the impact of our long-term family planning as well. Okay, I'm doing okay with time. I also wanted to highlight some AYA specific clinical trials. So this has been really interesting in finding clinical trials that are specific to this age group. And again, the ages have varied very much so between the clinical trials that we found. This is one focused on, of course, drugs for anti-TNFs, and was specific to AYAs and clinical trials. And this clinical trial to the right is focused more so on like psychosocial outcomes and lived experience. But I think that these trials can have a huge impact in the way that we think about age because they already exist. And so they really can be a blueprint because a lot of the ages for these psychosocial clinical trials especially have been created very intentionally to capture developmental milestones as well. So I think there is a blueprint, but we just have to adapt that from the mental health space, psychosocial space to the actual biological space. But again, we're very excited to see trials such as this BMJ that was published in BMJ as well. And so we also wonder, do non-pharmacologic options and trials have better age stratification? So this particular trial is for vagus nerve stimulation, and it only includes adolescents and young adults. And it's really fascinating. We haven't been able to figure out exactly why, but again, we seem to have found a trend that more of the non-pharmacologic interventions are including different ages in a more appropriate way rather than just lumping young adults in a specific demographic. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking out this trial just because it's also very interesting. Vagus nerve stimulation is a super interesting topic, just side note. And so as we're thinking about the importance of looking at AYAs in clinical trials, we increasingly see that for particular diseases, the peak of onset is in adolescence, actually. So for example, with inflammatory bowel diseases, IBD has a peak onset in adolescence. And if we see the incidence for both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which are classified as inflammatory bowel diseases, you see the incidence is the highest both in adolescents and young adults. Again, which is an indication that we really need to be looking at this demographic separately. And of course, the fact that there is a differing microbiome throughout the lifespan, there's multiple studies about this, but when we think about the microbiome in young adulthood versus adulthood, older adulthood, it's vastly different. And so we also need to look at how drugs could be impacting this demographic differently too. So when we're looking at some of the systemic barriers to including adolescents and young adults in clinical trials, I mean, one of the most obvious for us is the societal perception of who really is sick. Traditionally, we might think of people who are older to actually be sick, and we might not actually think about the fact that chronic illness is again growing in young adulthood, and more of us are being sick during this time period. Again, there's a huge lack of clarity surrounding the adolescent and young adult period. I think part of that could be remedied with this idea of having very similar terminology. So skipping the term youth and really being very specific about how we talk about age. Because again, I think there's a huge difference even between adolescents and young adults. But oftentimes we group those together because both groups have been very much underrepresented in a lot of conversations about age. Another big issue, and we haven't exactly been able to figure out why, but we've noticed that 18 to 65 or 18 to 64 has often been grouped. And we feel like this might be an arbitrary number, again, because we don't know the history behind why 18 to 65 or 18 to 64-year-olds are grouped together. And it's interesting because older adults have been more and more recognized as a special population, as they very much should. But you can see the stratification a lot narrower in most trials for older adults as well. And then there's a big lack of adequate reporting of age data from sponsors. So this is just anecdotal experience. We've tried really hard to get specific age data for specific trials, and we have been declined so. And that only makes us wonder why even more, just because we want to know how many young adults have been included in particular trials, but oftentimes are unable, or every time are unable to receive this information. And the standard 18-year-old cutoff, again, can pose a barrier, as I mentioned, because of the transition and transfer of care. And so when we're thinking about clinical trials and the authorization of clinical trials, we also have to think about the fact that, this is a very unstable time period. And so the loss to follow-up is a big concern as well. And so a paradox I also wanted to highlight is that we are very heavily marketed to as an age demographic. And I talked about this yesterday with pharma DTC, but if we're being heavily marketed to, and very clearly with medications like Nurtec ODT, where they use younger influencers and they use younger methods for actually attracting patients, we want to make sure that our demographic is included if we are being the most marketed to for particular therapeutics. And so this is a paradox that we see, and this is an op-ed I wrote last March, about the need to include young adults in clinical trials and to distinguish this population, especially as we're seeing more and more marketing towards AY, adolescents and young adults. And also, if you didn't realize, AY means adolescent and young adults. It's a little late to say that, but I hope it's been a little bit obvious. Anyway, but special populations in clinical trials, this is a list. I don't know if it's fully comprehensive, but it does include a lot of the special populations that we've seen being identified. And so we wonder how young adults could be included as a special population, if they should be included as a special population, or if they should just be more distinguished within clinical research and have more of a subgroup analysis there. I don't think I'm going to go too much into the historical regulatory context specific to pediatrics, just because that's like pretty much, you can find that online, but it's very interesting. I think the extrapolation component of the pediatric labeling rule is very interesting, and extrapolation in general is a topic that we're really thinking about a lot, specifically because when we think about extrapolation of efficacy, we also want to make sure that that doesn't automatically include extrapolation of safety, and that there is adequate safety data and further trials to ensure that safety is a part of making sure that, or safety is an equal part of efficacy as well. And so these are some really interesting and really important pieces of legislation for pediatrics, and ensuring, and there's a huge gap still in terms of pediatric and adult approvals, but still this is a start, and we wonder how young adults can be tacked on to some of this legislation or have similar legislation as well. And so, as I mentioned, oncology has been what we feel like a big leader in investigating AYAs as a special population. So this quote from a particular research article says, although AYAs treated on pediatric protocols may incur more toxicity as the protocols are designed for pediatric drug metabolism, AYAs face a different but related issue when being treated on protocols designed for older adults. So we know that pediatric dosing might not work the same for AYAs, and older adults or adult dosing might not work for AYAs. And this article in particular really lays out a lot of the physiological differences that we're seeing with AYAs as well. And so in AYA cancer, they have defined young adults, adolescents, and young adults. Again, we're not really sure as to why. So if someone has the answers, we'd love to know. But we know that AYAs have been defined as 15 to 39. For the increase of cancer, we know that from 1973 to 2015, cancers in AYAs increased by 30%. And so we also know that the survival rates have not improved for AYAs the same as they have for other demographics as well, which again is very concerning because of drug disposition and the potential that potential dosing concerns as well. And the finding in AYA cancer really highlights the need to investigate other disease areas too, which we're severely lacking right now. And so these are some of the most common cancers that are identified in adolescents and young adults. You might be surprised, as I was a little bit surprised to find some of these on the list, like testicular cancer in 15 to 19, and breast cancer in young adult women is one of the most common cancers from ages 20 to 29. And it also happens to be one of the most aggressive forms of breast cancer that tends to affect young adult women as well. And so with that being said, this is a screenshot from a multidisciplinary review for this particular medication, which I'm not going to say because I forget how to say it every single time. But basically, this is from the Monarch 2 trial. And as you can see, the median age range is 59 years old. But what's really concerning to us is, given that young adult women are very much likely to, or breast cancer is one of the highest cancers in young adult women, we are a little bit, well, quite upset by the fact that 65 and under is completely grouped together. And so again, you just wonder about the drug disposition in younger populations than in like a 64-year-old. And so this just highlights a need to really think about age and to understand age as separate as well. And so this is an example of vedolizumab, which is a drug approved for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. This multidisciplinary review was specific to Crohn's disease, but it was interesting because for patients under 35 years of age, you saw actually better treatment outcomes, which is interesting because this can highlight the importance of, again, investigating like under 35 and young adults as a separate group. For efficacy, but also for safety. So if you look at the placebo versus the actual treatment. So this is just one example. So moving on to adverse event reporting. Sorry if I'm going very fast. I just have a lot. So I want to make sure I can get through it again. But so when we're looking at adverse event reporting, this is something that, again, as I mentioned before, has been of particular concern to our age demographic, just because of the disproportionate number of adverse events we hear from our community members. And so this is Mara Shapiro. She was a fellow for the Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network last year. She's 23 years old, has Crohn's disease and Addison's disease, and she really is focused on understanding the long-term effects of medications and how, again, this would impact her different than it would a 65-year-old. And I think for a lot of us as young adults, we want to take comfort in the fact that these long-term studies are happening, but unfortunately, we don't feel like they're happening and happening at a pace where, the future generation of patients will be able to have an understanding of adverse events of these newer therapeutics as well. Moving on. So the FDA adverse event reporting system and the vaccine adverse event reporting system, these are administered by two different agencies. So FDA's FAERS is obviously administered by FDA, and the vaccine adverse event reporting system is administered by the CDC. And so when we look at the different age stratifications, again, we've tried to look up how these have been stratified, but there is no historical context to this. But as you can see, the CDC has done a significantly better job in terms of looking at age for adverse events than the FDA has. And so we're really trying to think about how FDA can stratify or maybe mirror CDC's stratifications for vaccines. And so moving on, so we know that I kind of already mentioned this, but with COVID vaccines, we saw different adverse events in adolescents and young adults. And thiopurines and IBD, this is something that's very personal to me as well, given that I have IBD and I've been on these medications. But we've seen that, again, that the highest incidence for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis is in children and young adults. Just as a reminder, if I haven't highlighted that enough, but there was a review that showed that patients with this particular cancer who received long-term therapy longer than 2 years and were under the age of 35 were the most likely to be impacted by this cancer. And so we have this preliminary data, but we don't know how much further investigation has been done. And this only makes us wonder what other adverse events for young adults are we not capturing because we're not looking at this age group separately. And so these are some common concerns that we hear about subgroup analysis. So the fact that if we reduce the number size, we might increase the confidence intervals, especially if there are not enough people enrolled in the age subgroup. Another issue that we commonly hear is a need to develop appropriate age stratification for every single disease, especially when we're thinking about delayed puberty for particular conditions that might have a result in terms of different developmental milestones, and it might make sense to stratify particular disease areas differently. And then this idea of, can we not just extrapolate from adult trial data? And again, I think our biggest concern and my biggest concern is this idea that we'll look at efficacy, but safety will be left behind in terms of the trial data as well. And I think extrapolation is obviously different based off of separate diseases. For rare diseases, it's different. The idea is then more common chronic conditions as well. And the urgency of extrapolation is obviously understandable for rare diseases as well. And so some of the barriers to recruitment and retention of young adults in clinical trials, things that we've heard over and over again, is the fact that a lot of young adults don't want to disclose that they are using recreational drugs or alcohol. And so these are often exclusionary factors for clinical trials. And so we see that they're just not wanting to enroll because they don't even want to have to deal with that disclosure of recreational drug use or alcohol usage. And young adults with chronic conditions are significantly more likely to use recreational drugs and to use alcohol. And so we know that this is very common amongst our demographic and a huge reason, again, as to why young adults may not want to participate in trials when they see that exclusionary factor. Intimidated with informed consent. I think this is probably true for almost every single age group about the informed consent process. But again, really meeting patients where they are in an accessible way that really explains the process is something that's really important. Again, concerns about family planning, which I've already discussed, and parental interference. This is a really unique age group where you're somewhat potentially still under your parents, but also starting to transition independently. And this is an area where we hear parents trying to potentially guide their patients in one way or their children in one way or another. And so this is something that's very confusing for young adults if their parents have strong opinions about their participation in trials as well. And this last idea of trust, and this is probably a little bit of a deeper ethical concern, but we know that so many of our community members have read about the history of the FDA, are very informed about the history of the industry. And so when we think about trust, we have to think about if the trust is actually deserved for our young adults to be able to participate. A huge concern we have is like, will my trial be reported or will it just stop and never be reported? Because our community members have heard this. And again, it goes into this deeper idea of if we're going to expect young adults to trust the system, we have to make sure that that trust is deserved with adequate reporting of trial data, but also making sure that these medications are affordable when they come out to market. So as I mentioned, the affordability is a big concern that we hear from our community. So I participated in this trial, but after the trial, what's going to happen, not just in the immediate future, but I mean, I have to plan my entire life surrounding whether I can afford this medication or not, or have proper insurance. And so this is a big question that we get a lot. Another one is communication methods. So when we're thinking about the different ways that young adult patients are communicating, is email the best way? Is phone the best way? Is text message the best way? And we've seen different communication methods with different trials, but I think overall there's a big need to switch communication methods to meet patients where they actually are. The lack of plain language information, which I know the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center is doing a great project on plain language within clinical trials, and something that's just increasingly important to include graphics, visuals, etc., within clinical trial information. And this last idea is something that we have thought about a little bit, but haven't really explored. But this idea of young adults are a lot less likely to be retained within trials. And so when we look at adherence of trials as well, and we look about the power of peer support and potentially increasing retention of trials, that's something that could be explored. I don't know ethically how that would work, but again, for lupus patients, a peer support intervention on an online forum did improve adherence for that particular therapeutic or regimen. And so again, this is an option that could be explored within trials as well. Another anecdote from an anonymous young adult patient in our community shared about how they were particularly concerned about the fact that they have familial responsibilities and the fact that there's a lot of expectations on young adults as is, and the fact that young adults in a lot of cases are just struggling to make ends meet. And so there is a huge burden of participating in trials. And this individual really wanted to participate in a trial, but there were just too many systemic barriers inhibiting them from actually being able to participate, one of which being the financial instability of being 19 and having so many familial responsibilities. Next slide. So some of our recommendations, these are not going to be comprehensive, but they are just some very basic things that we came up with as we were thinking about what could be done to really incentivize and understand our age group is separate. So one is, as I mentioned before, consider different payment structures that make sense across different ages. So again, should young adults be compensated more, or is there a potential for, if we're trying to increase enrollment of young adults, should we also increase compensation due to their particular time period rather than pediatrics or adults? Again, I don't have the answer to that, but there is a consideration there. the fact that pediatric and adult subspecialties should work together to design these studies, especially if we're trying to increase enrollment of young adults. We have to make sure that peds and adult centers are working together, not in silos for clinical trials. Pharmaceutical companies should make their data available for researchers to analyze. So we don't necessarily expect them to do the subgroup analysis, but we would love to be able to take that data and understand how young adults have been included in trials and the potential for different drug disposition. Clinicians could do retrospective studies of outcomes, both efficacy and safety for their younger patients, particularly adult doctors could do so. And then consideration of Bayesian approaches to supplement adolescent data with young adult data as well, which is an area that I know FDA and EMA are exploring a lot more. Our recommendations part 2 is to have a working group. This is a very simple recommendation, but
Advance your slide.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Holly. Yeah, so working group to ensure that there's a progress in understanding this demographic is separate. Again, it would be really powerful to have a separate advisory council or separate working group just focusing on AYAs in particular, because that has not been done to our knowledge. Maybe in cancer it has been done, but not in other disease areas. And with Fedora, we also think that there's an opportunity to attach age and having age distinguished for AYAs under the diversity plans that they are going to be releasing comment for again. And we actually worked on comments related to clinical trial diversity in PDUFA this past year. We really tried very, very hard to get some language related to at least trying to get more studies done or trying to understand this age demographic differently. And so we submitted that for some open comment periods. And then we've also submitted comment for disease-specific areas like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, where they've released guidance about adult trials, but they haven't included young adults or they haven't included the stratification that we feel is appropriate. Our recommendations also go on to the fact that this is just a disclaimer. This is an example of a therapeutic that usually is used by older adults due to the nature of multiple myeloma. But we found this language to be very interesting because it highlights the fact that the FDA has in the past called out that we can't just generalize safety for age. And so we really do believe that the FDA has the potential to do this for other studies and to ensure that sponsors are not generalizing safety across the board. And so we really liked this language that FDA used in really calling out and ensuring that we are not generalizing, again, the safety of particular ages. Another recommendation on age is the increasing use of developmental periods rather than chronological age for adverse event reporting systems and bigger systems like that. Chronological age might make the most sense because we can't have disease specific, or maybe we can, I don't know, but feasibly it doesn't seem like we can have disease specific adverse event reporting systems. But the Tanner stages of pubertal development are something that has been used and was mentioned quite a bit in this guidance document, and something that seems a lot more reasonable when we're thinking about the developmental milestones for young adults as well. And a couple of more things. One thing I just wanted to shout out Holly too, because she's created an amazing resource called Diverse Bioethics, and we have copied her strategy because we really feel like patients should be part of all aspects of clinical research, and the idea of including adolescents and young adults in clinical trials will only be made possible by including the perspectives of AYAs in clinical trials. And these are some of our past fellows. It is IBD specific, but we have young adults across different disease groups that are willing and excited to participate in clinical research in the design process and providing perspectives, etc. And this work has just started, and we need academics to partner with us. This is very early on in terms of our understanding of AYAs. Again, cancer has done a phenomenal job, in our opinion, of really highlighting and distinguishing this population, but we feel like a lot more has to be done, and we need academics and researchers to partner with us. And just want to acknowledge the following doctors and people who have helped us create these ideas and really vetted a lot of our work as well. So that is all. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I am going to ask, Lisa, can we take down the screen sharing so that we can see the folks who are on Zoom as well? And those of you who are on Zoom, we'd love for you to come, come on camera, I should say. And you're welcome to raise your hand if you have a question that you'd like to ask, and I can call on you. Any questions in the room before we go online? Okay, I see Kate you have your hand raised. Kate, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm quite sick. I'm just gonna do audio. This is really wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this work and sharing it. I was curious about brainstorming, or what your thoughts are about the compensation recommendation that you made. And I know that you're at early stages of thinking that one through. But I was wondering what your thoughts might be on an agreement where the company would ensure lifetime access for young adults to the drug, or for any participants, as a way to equalize the investment or the return, or if that might actually feel risky, as it might make young adults feel like that's their only option to guaranteed health care long term, and be willing to take on a greater risk than they might otherwise. Curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and question. I think to that, I would say, just from my perspective, we're not, at least in IBD, I don't think we're on these medications for a long time. And so a lot of us are switching therapeutics very quickly, because the therapeutics that we have are okay, but they're not wonderful, and they're not something that we can all be on for decades and for the rest of our lives. So I would say that that probably wouldn't be exciting to me personally, because I know, unfortunately, just realistically, I would probably be changing my medications several more times before, older adulthood. So I guess it also depends on the therapeutic. For something like Trikafta or Kalydeco, maybe that would be appealing, but for a space like IBD, I don't think that would be appealing to young people, at least not for me. So.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna, Sneha, that was fabulous. And I'm wondering, when you go and talk to NIH and FDA and the other, entities that you want to encourage to, include adolescents and young adults in research, I assume you give them a pretty similar presentation. So what kind of pushback are you getting? Why is this not happening? You've laid it out so clearly why it's important, steps that could be taken to improve it. What's standing in the way still?
I think it's the lack of evidence that we have generated as a group. And I think it also is the fact that we are a patient advocacy group. And so we probably need a lot more robust evidence than any researcher would. And so I think that, just in my opinion, feels like one of the reasons, because we are a young adult patient-led nonprofit. And so we have a little bit less, I feel like, inherent trust in us. So that's why we really need academics and researchers to help, because when we go to these agencies, it feels like we're just one patient advocacy group. And collectively, I think if we had more coalitions and that sort of thing, we could potentially have more support. But I think the evidence generation piece is something that we really need help with in terms of academics and researchers, even though there is a lot of evidence that exists. But I think that would be something that would be really powerful for us to be able to actually have some traction on this issue as well. So.
Great, thank you. And Steve, I see your hand is raised. And I'm also being told that people are not able to share their videos even if they want to. So maybe that's something on the do. Oh, there we go. You are able to share it.
Yeah, so some setting must have just been changed. Hey, Sneha, that was a wonderful talk. Maybe my question, piggybacks a bit on Holly's, but it seems that, the NIH has obviously an institute devoted to child health and disease. They've got an institute related to aging. And then most of the other things are institute and centers that are really kind of general, right? That are, or at least disease specific, but don't have a kind of age flavor. And so it seems like there's some sort of like inter-institute coordinating function that is needed in order to be able to address this issue that you're talking about, that is so important. Thinking about somebody in their 20s or 30s is not the same as thinking about somebody in their 50s or 60s. So has there been any discussion at the NIH of mechanisms that might allow for some coordination across institutes that you're aware of?
I'm not actually very much aware, but I know the plan across the lifespan is something that we're really interested in looking at, because they have called out obviously the need to include like ages unless or all ages unless it's not relevant for the particular age group, the therapeutic or whatever is not relevant for that age group. But yeah, we haven't really looked into more interagency collaboration with the NIH and FDA. We've mostly just looked at the individual programs that they have and the potential for that. And I would say we were really excited about the UFAs and the potential to work on that or attach this to the UFAs. And I think the angle that we're trying to go, at least with FDA, is more so with diversity of age within clinical trials. So, but that's a really good idea. And Steve, I think you volunteered yourself to help us. So thank you.
At your service.
Any other questions in the room or online? Let me ask you this follow-up question about compensation, right? So you very clearly laid out the many structural challenges for people for adolescents and young adults to participate, even if they want to, even if they're eligible to participate, all of these financial constraints. So when you say compensation, do you have in mind, reimbursement of their travel and, lodging? Do you also mean, covering their time away from work? Do you mean, paying them a stipend? Maybe you can talk in a little bit more detail about what would actually be most useful to the community.
Yeah, I think, for a lot of young adults, again, having a job in addition to college, in addition to being sick, is one of the hardest things. And so if there could be a compensation model where people are being paid like hourly or equal wages as like a part-time job, I think that could really incentivize people to actually participating in a trial, if of course it's warranted in that trial. It's hard for me to generalize because I think it's trial and disease specific in many ways, but at the same time, I also think having an administrator who can help with writing letters to like higher ed institutions, for example, about why they need to take off of school or work. I think that could also be something that would be really important, is that administrative help as well. But I think compensation could mean a lot of different things for a lot of different young adults. And I think, yeah, especially the fact that a lot of people have to be employed in college is something that is a big barrier, because if they didn't have that, they would just be focusing on college. So yeah. But I think, I think the administrative coordinator is something that could be also really, really powerful for helping coordinate between higher ed and work and everything else that's going on in life. So.
Great. And there's a question posted in the chat from Laura Hart, who asks, how might older IBD patients contribute to your advocacy work?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe if they were at some point a young IBD patient, they could talk about their experience during that transition. But I also think the support from older adults and adults is a model that we could use, because older adults have been recognized as a special population. And I think in some ways that could be translated to young adults. Again, I think we have to be very careful when we think about special populations to not just jump on every age being a special population. But I think they could definitely help amplify this a little bit more, just because we are really one of the only organizations focused on young adult patients specifically. And so oftentimes, most of the burden is on us to talk and articulate these issues. So we would definitely be very, very willing to have any allies talk about this more.
Great. And Steve tells me he has another question.
Yes, Sneha, I'm wondering if, with over the last 10 years or so since the Affordable Care Act came online, there have been big changes in insurance coverage for young adults, whether they be because people could stay on their parents' plans till 26, or because of the availability of individual insurance that previously was harder to get or more expensive. Do you have any sense of how that has interacted with the ability to be on trials or access to trials? Has it increased it? Has it hindered it? Because previously you could go on a trial as an alternative, as a way of getting medical care that might not otherwise be available? Or is there just not data out there about this question?
I don't think there's data out there about this question, because I've actually looked into the policy of clinical trials for young adults and I haven't found anything. But I would just say that not a lot of people in our community are still on their parents' insurance. A lot of them have transitioned to Medicaid at age 18, et cetera. So I think that's something that just to note for our demographic too, is that while a lot of them might be on their parents' insurance till 26, that isn't true for a lot of our community members as well. But that'd be really interesting to investigate that as well.
Let me ask you a broader question. As you transition beyond being an adolescent and young adult yourself, how do you perceive your role leading this type of patient advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think we will always be young adult patient led in some capacity, whether that means I will be leading this or another young adult patient will be leading this. But I think in a lot of ways, the fact that we are young adult patient led really ensures that we are very much attuned, and we try. This is a constant journey to the needs of our community, and everything that we try to do is co-developed by our community. And I think that's an aspect that we will always have to keep as part of Generation Patient, to ensure that the evidence that we present, et cetera, is in line with people's experiences, because there's often a disconnect between the research that occurs and the actual experiences of community members.
Okay, great. Any last burning questions before we close? All right, well then please join me in thanking Sneha for a fabulous talk.
Thank you.
We're getting a lot of praise in the chat as well.
Yeah, I see a lot of people I know, so it's exciting.
Great.